Welcome back. Let's continue with Business Math B Unit 4 Key Concepts. We're moving on to Lesson 18, Calculating Projected Sales. Projected sales are the total number of sales expected for the upcoming time frame based on sales from our last time period and historical growth percent. I know this definition initially is a bit vague, and as normal, this is one of those things that in context will make sense, but when you read just the dry definition, it can be a little bit confusing. Basically, projected sales are what we expect our sales to grow by. So in fact, I would associate projected sales with the word growth. What we expect our sales to grow by based on the behavior that we've had so far. Okay, and there are two equations that we associate with projected sales. One is sales for next year, one is projected sales. So if we look at this sales for next year equation, it's equal to sales this year plus projected sales. In other words, whatever your base is, plus some percentage that we think will grow by. Projected sales, again, are it's that percentage that we think will grow by, and it's found by taking your current sales by a certain percentage. And again, if that's not clicking, that's okay. This will make much more sense when we look at an example. So let's get to it. So let's say that sales of a chocolate bar increased an average of 6% per year over the past 5 years. And this year's sales of chocolate bars were $2,500,000. Based on this trend, what might the sales be for next year? So, our goal is to figure out what sales might be next year based on what sales were this year and based on the growth pattern that this product has enjoyed over the past couple of years. So since they're asking for sales next year, pull out your sales for next year equation. Notice that sales for next year involves projected sales. This is something that's almost never going to be given to you in the prompt. So you'll almost always have to pull out the projected sales equation as well. Let's see if we can match up our information and see what has been given to us and go from there. Okay, so sales this year. Right away we see that sales this year were $2.5 million. So that's going to be what sales for this year is equal to. Again, projected sales we're not sure yet, so we'll have to wait and solve our projected sales equation before we can plug in and solve for its sales next year. So let's keep going. Projected market sales. So this is a bit tricky. Projected market sales is actually also equal to the $2.5 million. So in this case, this variable or this number is functioning under two variable names. So it's functioning as sales this year, but it's also functioning as our projected market sale. Now I know that's a bit confusing. That's just the way these equations are designed, and there's reasoning behind that we won't get into. So just try to keep that straight. Again, think of projected sales as trying to measure the growth in either units or dollars based on the money or the units you've already sold this year and the percentage you think you'll grow by. When you think of it in that regard, I think it makes a little bit more sense as to why we're plugging that number in there. Now we're multiplying that by a market share factor, which in this case is just referring to our percent growth. So we're thinking that it's going to grow by 6%, so we're going to write 6% expressed as a decimal here. So when we plug that in, our projected sales then are the $2.5 million times 0.06. In other words, the point of this equation is just to say, okay, we made $2.5 million in sales this year. We think we'll get 6% more in sales next year. What does that dollar amount work out to be? 6% of 2.5 million is 150,000. So we're saying that next year we expect to earn an additional $150,000. And that's what the sales for next year equation is doing. It's saying, okay, we made $2.5 million this year. We think we'll make another $150,000 this upcoming year for a total of $2,650,000. Now this is again one of those cases where I think it would almost be easier to do this just based on your own logic and reasoning, because these equations are a bit confusing. So use whatever method makes more sense to you. Okay, let's look at another example. Sales of school supplies at an office supply store increased an average of 3% per year over the past 4 years. This year's sales of school supplies was $150,000. Now, based on this trend, what might sales be for next year? So again, highlight the question. What are our sales going to be next year based on the activity that has happened this year? So again, we sold $150,000. We think we're going to grow by 3%. So what is that going to look like? What's that additional amount of money on top of the $150,000 that we're going to earn, and what's that grand total going to be? To figure that out, we can use our sales equations. So we're trying to figure out sales for next year. Again, sales for next year is equal to sales this year plus projected sales. We know our sales this year were $150,000, but we have to figure out our projected sales. Projected sales is just saying either the unit number or the dollar number of growth that we expect on top of our current sales. So in other words, if we made $150,000 and we think we're going to grow 3%, well then what's 3% of $150,000? It's $4,500. So we're saying that we think our sales for next year are going to be the $150,000 that we made this year plus a growth of $4,500 for a grand total of $154,500. So I hope that was a little more clear the second time through, and this is kind of why I picked this as one of the topics. I don't think the math is particularly difficult, but I think the variable names are a little misleading. Now, if you're still working on kind of settling that in your head and getting that straight, perfect, you're in exactly the right spot that you should be. However, there is a shortcut that I am going to offer. If you don't want to confuse yourself by looking at a shortcut, feel free to ignore just this next little bit I'm going to draw down here. If you have a good grasp of those two examples we just showed, this shortcut might be worthwhile. So again, notice that what we did is we figured out sales for next year based on our current sales plus projected sales. So we had a certain number of sales that I'm going to represent as 100%. Okay, $150,000, that was 100% of our sales. And we said, next year, I think we're going to even make 3% more. So we would express that as 103%. So a short way of reading this is to say that this year, we made $150,000. Next year, we think we're going to make 103% of that. Okay, that's again, that same amount plus an additional 3%. So an alternate way of calculating this would have been to calculate 103% of 150,000. Written out, that would look like this. 150,000 times 103 written in decimal form. That also would have given us the answer of $154,500. Again, this is an alternate method. This is a shortcut method. If it doesn't make sense, if you want to stick to method number one, that's fine. These are two different ways of reaching the same answer. Okay, our last example. Last year's sales of a yoga mat were 185,000 units to sporting goods stores and 65,000 units to a home goods store. Sales to both markets are expected to increase by an average of 10% this year. What is the predicted combined total of unit sales of mats to both of these stores this year? Okay, so this is the same problem. We've added a little bit of complexity, but essentially it's the same. Okay, so once again, we're trying to figure out the predicted combined total sales based on the fact that one branch or one store made 185,000 unit sales, another sold 65,000 units, and we think that each one will grow by 10%. So we're saying, what's the total going to be for both of these if they each grow by 10%? So there's more than one way to calculate this. I'm going to show it, I think, in a way that is a little more explanatory. You could certainly find shortcuts in different ways to do this. So again, we're being asked to predict and figure out what our sales for next year are going to be. I'm going to choose to calculate this separately. So I'm going to choose to make a calculation first for the yoga mats at the sporting goods store, and then later I'll go back and deal with the home goods store. Again, this is not the only way to do this. So for now, I'm just going to focus on that sporting goods store. So I know there were 185,000 units, and I know that we expect an increase of 10%. So if I want to figure out the projected sales for that store, I can take 10% of 185,000 to figure out my projected sales. Okay? I can take, oops, that's wrong. I can take 185,000 multiplied by, I think it's going to grow by 10%, which comes out to, that would be $18,500. So my projected sales are 10% of the sales I had already made, which comes out to $18,500. Okay? So that means, and I will write this in green, that means that's my projected sales, and this is for the sporting goods store. That means that I think that the sales for next year for the yoga mats at this store are going to be the sales that I had before, that 185,000 units, plus an additional 18,500 units. Okay, that's going to be my sales for next year. Now I'm going to do the same thing for the other store, the home goods store. They're projecting the same thing, a growth of 10%. So that means that I need to find 10% of 65,000, which is 6,500. So they're saying that they think that they're going to add an additional 6,500 unit sales on top of the 65,000 that they made this year. So that means the sales for next year are going to be equal to the 65,000 units, which were the sales this year, plus 6,500 units, which are the projected additional sales that we think we're going to make. So I've calculated that individually for each store, but remember, our goal was to figure out the predicted combined total. So I need to add all of these sales together. So I would take, I think my projected sales are going to be 185,000 plus 18,500 plus 65,000 plus 6,500. And now I didn't preload this example like I did with the other one, so I'm going to pull out a calculator. Okay, here we go. So 185,000 plus 18,500 plus 6,500 plus 65,000 gives me a grand total of 275,000. So that means I think that the total, based on the fact that each of these will probably grow by 10%, will be 275,000 unit sales. So that's it for this segment. Go ahead and move on to the asynchronous activity associated with this video, which you should find just below this video. I'll see you in the next segment.